Hi, this is Chris Kiefer, and welcome to the Power of ERDC podcast. Even after a wildfire devastates a community, a lingering threat remains. Soil and vegetation changes caused by wildfire damage amplify the risk of a catastrophic post-wildfire flooding and debris flow. It is a threat that experts will be watching closely this year, as forecasts predict both a more active wildfire season this summer and El Niño conditions that could bring higher rainfall totals this fall. ERDC researchers have spent years studying this phenomenon and have developed models that accurately capture the unique physics and help communities better prepare for and mitigate this potential danger. On this episode, we will discuss how ERDC is helping protect against these post-wildfire floods. Joining us is Dr. Travis Dahl, a senior hydraulic engineer at ERDC's Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory, or CHL. Welcome, Travis.
Good to be here, Chris.
Yes, and we also have Dr. Floyd, a research physical scientist at CHL. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Chris. Great to be here.
Yeah, glad to have both of you. I think it's going to be a great discussion. And really, each of you guys have conducted post-wildfire research for more than a decade, and especially focusing on, as we mentioned at the top, the flooding risk that follows the wildfire. In fact, Ian, you were actually on the very first episode of this podcast back in January of 2021.
That's right.
Talking about this podcast, and it goes way, research goes way back.
That's right. Not as many cameras
on that. Yeah, that's right. We've grown and changed through the years, so it's good to have you back on again. But so can y'all, both of you, talk about your research at a high level? What makes this a unique and important challenge? And maybe Travis, you start on that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I think the first thing to understand is a lot of people tend to focus on the fire, the damage itself. The trees are gone, and that's that's important. A lot of effort goes into that, and there's a huge threat of loss of life. But then what's less what a lot of people don't give thought to is that part of what that vegetation was doing is it was intercepting rain that was coming down, and it was slowing it down as it runs off. And so once you burn that landscape, both because of the change of vegetation and also changes that happen because of burned soils, you get rain coming, that water comes off the landscape a lot faster. And so you really can increase the flooding risk. And people have observed 10 to 100 times higher flood peaks after wildfires.
Yeah. And I think a point to add to that as well is the soils are altered. We call it hydrophobicity, to where soils are somewhat water repellent. It speeds up the runoff time. And on top of flooding, you can have a continuum of debris flow responses as well that are very deadly, that can in some cases be 1,000 times larger than the flood event, although those numbers tend to be maybe a little bit higher than we normally see, but it isn't far-fetched to see that massive response following a fire. And this can persist for outside of Flagstaff, we have a site 25 years, 30 years. And then Mount Charleston in Nevada, outside of Las Vegas, we've seen dramatic debris flow response even 10 or 15 years after the fire.
After the fire, wow.
So a very continued risk and concern that we have for that hazard.
Looking, I guess when we talk about the unique challenge, a term I know you used a lot in stories we've done with you in the past, in non-Newtonian flow, I think is your term, but I mean, that kind of...
Yeah, and so these flows are just unique in how we model them. And one of the first things we did years ago was to implement some basic changes that allowed our models to do that in a physics-based way. Now we're realizing that there is more complexity that we're diving into. But yeah, the non-Newtonian flows are a complex passion of mine that Travis indulges, which is fantastic. And I know, leadership is always revolved around that as something that's important, but it is critical because it is a very binary condition. debris flow hits your home. It's not quite the same as just slowly rising floodwaters. They're both dangerous, but the outcome can be significantly worse for those debris flows, the non-Newtonian flows.
Sure. We talked at the top a little bit about the conditions this year, in particular with El Nino conditions. Are you more concerned about the potential not only for fires and then for post-wildfire flooding?
Travis, start.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the one of the things with El Nino patterns is they vary depending on where you are in the country, and so during a strong El Nino year, we tend to see hotter, drier conditions in the northern parts of the country. So particularly the Pacific Northwest. So they may be more at risk of wildfires than they normally are. And then, but then in areas like Southern Colorado, California, across the Southwest and even across the Gulf Coast, conditions may be wetter. Well, so maybe they don't have as much fire risk, but because they had fires last year and the year before, they have increased flood risk because of the El Nino conditions.
That's a point. That's absolutely right. One of the things always talked about is that the fires vary in space and time, but the flood risk varies in space and time as well. And so that really becomes a challenge where you think, oh, we're not going to have any fires. But 3 years ago, you had Eaton or Palisade fire. Well, 2 years ago. And, subsequently, increases in rain can cause increased flood risks. So it's kind of double-edged. You have to watch out for the fire risk, but then also for, some regions, that 25-year window to where you have to have an awareness of that increased flood or debris flow risk. And then I will say, I looked into some statistics. Right now, we're 195% above our average in burned acreage, and we're 140% for the 10-year average. We're 140% above the number of fires over the 10-year average. So we are seeing at this point in the year a significant increase in fire activity. I suspect that El Nino will dampen that in some region, but then also exacerbate the flood risk in others.
Yeah, sure. Those stats, that's nationally?
Yes, that's from the National Interagency Fire Center. So I just looked at those to refresh. It's about 2.4 million acres that have been burned as of May the 31st, which again is almost 200% greater than our 10-year average.
Yeah, wow.
So yeah, there's a risk there, but it is variable.
Yeah, sure. We talked at the top too about how long you all have been doing this research. What are some of the lessons learned from past wildfire seasons and kind of how this has kind of grown through the years?
I'll start first on that because as we first started seeing this, several things changed. I don't want to get too deep here. The first thing is that we need to be more proactive. The Army Corps and our partner agencies have been getting less reactive and more proactive, which is why we're developing these comprehensive tools and doing the science. That's one thing that's very important. I think that the other is there are challenges and complexities associated with this that aren't related to what we can do in science, but it's just how rugged or how difficult it can be to access data that's important for these regions. And so as we go into this, I think that a proactive approach that assume a fire is likely to occur, what are we going to do to address the fire risk, but then the long-term flood risk? And so for me, the biggest thing I've learned is being proactive, particularly if you're in the mountainous Western U.S., whether you're in the Pacific Northwest or Southwest U.S. And the other big thing is that there is a trend that we see where we have wet seasons that produce fuels, dry seasons that produce fuels for the fire, right? Vegetation grows, it dries out. And so being aware of where you are in that cycle in your region is very important in the Western U.S. especially. And then that can persist again for 20, 25 years. Now, that seems like a long time, and that probably is the far end of what we see, but that 10-year window after a fire in most of these places, there's a significant threat that you're going to deal with. So being proactive is the one thing that I've learned that we have to be on top of this.
Yeah.
I think coupled with that idea of having a wet season and dry season, which that especially in the Southwest, but also in the Pacific Northwest, there's kind of a similar phenomenon as that those seasons have started to merge over the years. They used to be very distinct. Like you'd have a wet season, then you'd have a fire season. And what's happening, what's been happening the last 10, 15 years is those seasons have been encroaching on each other. So if your fire season goes right up until your wet season, mitigation strategies that you would have for flooding, that you might have had in the past, you had several months to get them in place. Now you may have a fire that the reason it went out was because of the wet season, and you don't have as long to respond to it. So
Yeah.
and that's really another reason for that proactivity. I think one of the other big things we've learned is how these phenomenon vary between different regions.
Right.
So like a lot of attention, a lot of firework has gone into the arid Southwest, California, New Mexico, Colorado, where it's relatively dry. But what those kind of timelines are a little bit different in, say, the Pacific Northwest, where anecdotally, and we've seen this in our research, that sometimes there'll kind of be a spike in events like about 5 years post fire, as some of those trees that were dead and dying,
Yeah.
now they finally collapse and they release sediment into the river. And
Okay.
so we have this kind of lingering risk that occurs a number of years post fire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think in those regions, it's really important to kind of understand some of those nuances that lead to your flood risk. So for Portland, for example, we do see debris floods and higher level flood events. We certainly see that increase. What we don't see is so much of the production of the destructive debris flows that we see in Southern California. But what we do see is that post fire geotechnical failures, landslides, that type of thing that all become sediment management and
Right.
issues at our reservoirs and any infrastructure that the Army Corps controls.
Yeah, sure. And mentioning other regions and looking at, I know there were wildfires in Georgia and Florida this year too. I mean, are they kind of unique? I mean, I guess you're seeing the threats you're looking at regionally are unique.
Yeah, they are.
Different threats in the southeast.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think it's interesting that you bring up the fires in some of the fires in the east. Shortly before we already started getting heavily involved in this work, there had also been a fire up around Gatlinburg in Tennessee.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things I looked at a little bit in my PhD research was actually some of the huge fires that happened in the Great Lakes at the end of the 19th century. So even though we tend to think of large scale wildfire as a uniquely Western problem, it there's no reason it can't happen any place that we have large expanses of forest. And what becomes unique is the topography. So, if you've got the steep mountain terrain, that really lends itself to the debris flows. Or
Mm.
do you have um, consistent rainfall that's kind of slow and steady and allows vegetative regrowth? Because that vegetation, when it comes back in, as long as it stays green and doesn't just become fuel, it also will stabilize the landscape and kind of help mitigate the risk.
Flood risk, sure.
So there's definitely some regional differences in the patterns of risk.
And then the response obviously isn't as dramatic as you would see in mountainous, but you still have a persistent flood risk for several years. And as a matter of fact, talking about Gatlinburg, a lot of research is going on now. Some papers are coming out to show that a lot of the debris flows and flooding that occurred in that region were the result of previous burn scars that haven't completely healed. And so you drop a hurricane on top of recent burn scars, regardless if you're in North Carolina or in California, you're going to have some type of response that's dramatic. Now, that response probably only lingers for a few years. I like to joke that kudzu comes in pretty quick in the southeast with the humidity, but that doesn't preclude that there are other water quality and flood risk concerns that can persist for several years. Not only, talking about the fact of the fire affecting these regions as well itself, as opposed to the flood. So, yeah, concerns for us, and we're really still trying to wrap our arms around regionally how that's variable and coordinate with the right group so that we're collecting the data we need to
Yeah.
verify the differences that we see.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure. It's for both of you and your research, and again, as we kind of talked about, pioneered the use of physics-based models to predict this unique behavior of post-wildfire floods and debris flows. How are you transitioning this knowledge, and kind of what has been the impact as you've done that?
Sure. If you don't mind,
Yeah, you jump in
I'll,
on this one.
I'll start
Absolutely.
and you can correct me. Um, the yeah. So yeah, a, a new technique or a model is only used only useful if you get it in the hands of
Sure.
users. So, you know, part of our development has been talking to end users, especially folks at districts, trying to get an understanding of what their needs are, kind of almost pitching ideas to them, like saying, "Hey, we see this as a need. What do you guys think?" And then as we're developing it, we're also working with, we're developing these algorithms at ERDC, this code, these techniques. We're making sure that we're also partnering with the Hydrologic Engineering Center, which produces a lot of the software that's used at districts, in addition to our own in-house programs like ADH and Geisha, which are also used by districts. And then we're helping to make sure that the people that the engineers at districts are getting trained and understand how to implement these. And actually, we just had a situation earlier this year. We were talking to some folks at Albuquerque District, and they're working on designing a sediment retention structure downhill from an older burn scar, and they're trying to size it properly, and they wanted to use one of those techniques. And they came back to us and said, "We're not sure how to do this," and so that was helpful feedback, because now we're working with them to try and do a better job and say, "Okay, well, how do can we bound this? Is there a better way that we can describe this so that it's easier for you to implement?"
Yeah, and I think for us, as we're thinking in years ago, and we started with Albuquerque, actually was the first district that supported this through a statement of need, and then of course we've moved to every district out west, NWD and SPD. Um, Looking at what their needs were and trying to think about this, there's an emergency management, which is a response that we support with FEMA as part of their mission. And in that, there are tools that they use that are slightly different than what you would use if you're going to design a multi-million-dollar structure. And so we had to develop tools that could account for both of those. Obviously, when you're doing that initial response for things where it's rapid, as Travis mentioned, there's not much time, particularly in the Southwest, where flood season overlaps fire season. At the end of fire season, particularly, is a concerning time. But that infrastructure, getting it in place reactively with certainty on what's going to happen, is critical, because if you fail at the initial response, your long-term recovery is going to always be a challenge. You're going to likely be playing catch up. So I think it's important to point out that working with those districts to provide that feedback, that's what we've been doing for a decade now. What I will say, though, is as the districts have gotten better at doing that, our mission has changed too, because then we're looking at different sets of problems. And sometimes it's very specific, like, oh, what are these coefficients? And sometimes we have no idea what the erosion potential, for example. And so as we start to tackle those problems, we try to bend that in, are we doing this flood risk design, or are we trying to assist FEMA and our partner agencies in getting some advanced measures in place? And so those tools are a little different, but they still are packaged in either our ATC or our ERDC products.
Sure. Travis, what are some of the other ways that ERDC is supporting wildfire preparedness, response, and recovery?
Sure. Yeah, Chris, that's a great question. We've been really focused on the flood risk, which I think a lot of times that is kind of focused on, oh, it's a summer day, it's a fall day, we get a rainstorm, what happens? But there's also risk related to snowmelts and snowpack. And so one component of our research is looking at how snowpack changes because of wildfires. And there's been a number of papers, some by ERDC researchers in the last few years, that have indicated, well, after a fire, the snowpack melts out earlier, which means that now, instead of having expecting that spring flood, which you expect as a water manager, as an emergency manager, to happen, maybe typically in mid-April, now it's happening at the beginning of April. And so you have to kind of account for that. But our models don't yet. And so we're working on those improvements. We also have been working on some water quality related issues. And those, what is important depends kind of on where you are. And in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, some of the questions revolved around water temperature. and which isn't something you necessarily directly think of the Corps dealing with, but because we're managing so much water, it really impacts some of the threatened and endangered species like salmon. And so being able to make sure that we can supply cold water at the right time of the year to support the threatened and endangered species becomes important. And this really came, we were kind of aware of this, but it really started becoming an issue after the Eden Palisades fire. We started getting questions about, well, as this flooded waters are coming down, what else is in there? Are there contaminants? And as the Corps, what's the best way for us to deal with that as it moves through areas that we control, whether that's a reservoir or maybe it ends up in an area that we need to dredge. So we've started developing some workflows to help districts understand how to address those risks if that's something they're concerned about. We also have and I guess I should say that the work this also one of the great things about ERDC is we're not just limited to the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory.
Right.
So we have a Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory, CREL. Wyatt Reese and before him, Dr. Jeremy Giovando were involved in this research and integral parts of the team. Our water quality work is being led by Dr. Jody Ryder out of our Environmental Laboratory. We also have the Construction Engineering and Research Laboratory, CERL, and Dr. Heidi Howard and Wade Wall up there. They're part of a team that they're looking at wildfire issues, but they're more focused on military installations and especially the kind of the ecology and biology, how that is impacted and recovers from wildfires. And then and back at CHL, we also have people who their primary focus is looking at how do you manage river, or how do you do river engineering? How do you put in structures to mitigate against flood and sediment risk? And some of them have been working directly on post-wildfire impacts. Sure, particularly with groups like Albuquerque.
Yeah, and that a couple of things I'll add. That's great. No corrections this time. No. But so talking about the construction lab, they have carved a really great set of partners for installations, and installations are very important. One of the things I've talked about before is it's hard again, wildfires move in space and time, and the flood risk does, right? And so when you're talking about the whole state of California or Southern California or even a county like San Bernardino, it's massive, right? And it's hard to bound that problem and really to consolidate what you're going to be doing. So we have to be, unfortunately, a bit proactively reactive. Maybe that's
right.
And so, but with their group, they're looking at kind of preparedness, recovery, and we like to think of fire preparedness, response, and recovery as a continuum. It's a continuum for the wildfire because it can respond, but also a continuum for the flood risk. And so as we start to look at this and bring it all together, we feel that installations are right for us to bound our problem. They're top-down hierarchy, and they deal with a lot of the same problems that we would see in our society that span outside of that recovery that we focused on for so long. So I think, those are great points. And I'll make the last point I'll make on the construction. We knew going in that there would have to be some measures that are done after the fire, before the flood season, because this can persist for so long. And so Dr. Chris Herring from our lab at CHL has been looking into this for a number of years, but it is something that we do have to do more research on. It isn't easy because a lot of these systems are so complex. Trying to model it isn't probably worth the investment to a level, right? You don't want a 100% answer if it's super complex. What I'm trying to say is sometimes we need to build something and monitor it for 10 or 15 years to see how the system responds. And so, yes, that's something also that we see that's very important. And then on the suppression, one thing I'll mention, or on the response to the fire, that includes what the sheriff's office does, what the National Guard may do with evacuations, but it also includes what the firefighters do with suppression. That's something that also we haven't historically done at ERDC, but ERDC is well positioned to take on some of those gaps in our research fields to support those, not only at a scientific level, engineering level, but operational and decision making as well is we're seeing is very critical because jurisdictional concerns. It's this group's responsibility, that group's responsibility. We are seeing those come together, which is very nice. But there is, I think, work in bringing that continuum together so that we have that proactive approach throughout the year.
Yeah, sure. Talking, and we talked again about one of the strengths of ERDC is that you can work with all the different labs, and so you've got this cross-disciplinary expertise available to you. Another strength, I guess, is having both the civil works and military mission and being able to cross leverage across both of them. Like you mentioned, you can kind of use the installation as kind of a bounded area to see some things. How much you kind of see whether some of the knowledge gained there from the military side helping the civil works research, or how much have you seen some of the civil works research that you all have done helping on the military side?
I'll start. So, I was in the military, non-commissioned officer in the Army and Air Force. And so it's always a concern of mine, not only operationally how fires are affecting us, but installations. I think that there are some scenarios to where in the past we wanted to, I guess, interject what we've been doing. That hasn't happened, but in this past year, we actually have had 2 different Army requests for RFIs, actually 3, but the 2 that were fire related. One was debris flows somewhere else, but the request came directly from, I guess, Army North, 5th Army, that, hey, we need to understand what's going on with Eaton fires. We have people there. If it rains, how long after the rain can we drive around before we lose mobility, right?
Sure.
So we have been aware of that for a decade, but I feel like now the environment is very conducive for us to bring all that together. And that's what we've been working on with these groups that we're discussing. And so as we start to look at where we can, make improvements, but where we've been doing things, again, I still think the installations are particularly important. And also to note that it's not just installations out west, right? I mean, you have installations on the east that are going to be facing these same concerns. As those regions vary climatically, you may see variability in that, but still the persistence can stay there for a number of years, particularly for recovery. And if you don't get that continuum quite right, as I've mentioned, you always seem to be playing catch up. So my vision would be installations leading the way in how we do this so that we can learn across multiple domains, multiple partners and projects, not just civil works or military. And it's kind of hard to do that when your mission in the Army Corps for civil works isn't as comprehensive as we see, say, at an installation. So I think that over the next few years, we're working with Heidi Howard's group at Construction Lab. We're going to see implementation of more broadly developed tools.
Sure. Is there anything else on that point, Travis?
I will say that I am one of the other requests for information we received from the Army a couple years ago, and I was glad that they actually reached out because they were going to do a training exercise, a huge training exercise in Southern California, and they had they were gearing up for it, and then there was an atmospheric river that was forecasted to hit, and so they actually reached out and said, should we have this exercise? Should we be concerned? And so we were able to give them some guidance on, okay, these areas, they were burned. Yes, that's a high risk. Maybe not this area. That's okay.
Yeah.
But I was glad that they actually reached out where I don't think they would have known that 10 years ago to be asking those questions. So I think we are having an impact from that standpoint. And yeah, I kind of echo Ian's sentiments. We're also working with folks from the Department of the Army that are that deal with firefighting, but also deal with prescribed burns at installations to try and get a better understanding of how to better manage those and how those will play into varying flood risk.
Sure. And so one of our colleagues that we've developed is, as Travis mentioned, with the Department of Army, finding more information out. I'm realizing that the Army actually is one of the larger firefighting groups in the country. I didn't look up the numbers this morning, I should have, but it was top 5 in different agencies is what we do with prescribed burns and firefighting activities across our, 30 plus installations around the country. And so it was a little surprising for me. And so, I think that the threat there is doing controlled burns can be very helpful, but depending on where you are, there can be a very high risk. And so that's the scenario to where not only with where the fire is going to go based on atmospheric conditions, but what type of long-term trends could we see from a controlled burn that gets out of hand, which is a concern for all of us. So, the Army has a lot of firefighters that do a lot of work.
You mentioned earlier some of the work with Albuquerque District and in various districts. Can you talk about some recent projects and recent work with various USACE divisions and districts?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I already mentioned the working with Albuquerque District earlier this year. We actually just had Ian mentioned Dr. Chris Herring. He and a couple other folks from CHL were just out looking at how some mitigation projects that were put in a number of years ago, how they have fared over time, and how effective they've been. The LA district is one. So obviously the Eden and Palisades fires, we helped support them, and our tools were used by them to understand what the risk was going to be after the fire once the rain started falling. But we've also worked with those districts on other fires over the years. One of the other districts that we have worked with and actually are still cooperating with quite a bit is Portland District.
Yeah.
So they've had a number of fires a lot up and down the Willamette Valley that have impacted core reservoirs there. Some of them burning right up to the actual reservoir itself. And so we've been working with them to kind of monitor and understand the risk. And actually, one of those at Portland District, we're working with Portland District and the USGS and Portland State University. We've all kind of come together to try and understand the kind of the recovery history and how the risk is changing over time.
Yeah, the Pacific Northwest in that region, particularly around Portland and even west or east in Oregon, it's very unique. And there are a lot of nuances and feedbacks that are slightly different than what we'd see in Southern California. And so snowpack, for example, is very important. As we talked about, kind of some of the various hazards that you see following the fire are quite different. I'll also point out that periodically and throughout the process, we do training hands-on with our district partners. And so we've actually gotten to the point to where a few years ago, we've done a series of comprehensive training on our new tools, particularly some of the non-Newtonian stuff, but also some of the hydrology things that we've done as well to look at. So one of the concerns is, what are your initial conditions right after the fire, right? As we've talked about, sometimes you may not have any time between the fire and the flood.
Yeah.
And so being able to parameterize a model very rapidly for screening assessment, it can be very tricky because you have spatial variability in how the fire affected soils and vegetation. All that translates to different runoff times. And so we've been able to work very closely with Portland State on that to improve, but we've also done some work Walla Walla District, Sacramento. As a matter of fact, we just got reached out to by some new colleagues at Sacramento for a floodplain management study they want us to be involved in. And then, of course, over the years, I've worked with Sacramento to write the California Flood After Fire Playbook, and we have with Oregon as well. And so what we're seeing is actually this really cool thing to where, go forth and be prosperous, and they have been. And so it's been really interesting because the requests we see now are satisfying in some ways, but then like, oh, wait, this is something that we have to dive into more, as we discussed earlier. So having those districts involved early on in our research process has been great. And then I know we are revisiting with HH&C, so our hydrology and hydraulics community of practice. We will be having a core-wide info meeting from our districts coming up in July. And so it's another opportunity to gather feedback from our districts and what they need so that we can assess what we're doing in our models and then make the adjustments for specific tools that Portland may need that's similar but slightly different than what Albuquerque needs, for example. So it's nuanced, but we are getting our arms around those variabilities a lot better than we were 10 years ago.
And we've had recently, we've also had interest from districts that haven't been traditional partners. There some people from like St. Paul District have expressed interest in, well, what are you guys doing with post-wildfire hydrology? And so that's good that it's the interest is kind of echoes what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, where it's not just a Western U.S. problem.
Sure.
And the last point I think on this is what we are finding too is other agencies reach to our models. So I've been working very closely with the lead developer for Bureau of Reclamation for their model, which is a widely used model around the world. And the way we've designed our tools as libraries, they can link to those models and utilize the changes that we've made to execute their problems, because sometimes it's a region that may be familiar with a model and have an existing model that's calibrated and validated. And so them using that model saves time and money. And so we're also seeing that permeate across DOI and some state agencies as well, particularly for our HEC products or Hydrologic Engineering Center tools, would argue the most widely used tools of their kind in the world. And so having that as the end product for what we do for most of our stuff allows everyone to have access, but then it becomes double-edged because you get more questions and then you feed back in. But we're still seeing that pretty prevalent around, particularly regions to where we've had a historic partnerships with the Army Corps, the GS, or the Forest Service. So that's been very positive to see. So we, develop, we spend this research money, and multiple agencies get benefit from it.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned sedimentation a little bit at different times. I mean, is this research, I guess, also improving dam and reservoir operations as well?
Yeah, so one of the other hats I wear, I also do a lot of work on reservoir sedimentation, and that's been a big question anytime that we have a fire near a reservoir, is what's going to be the impact in terms of sedimentation. I could spend an entire podcast talking about a reservoir sediment, but I will say the kind of probably one of the most extreme examples of a post-wildfire impact was Cochiti Reservoir, which is actually part of what really kicked off all of this work over 10 years ago, where they had they had a couple fires upstream, and the sediment that resulted from those debris flows from flood events ate up a significant amount of the storage capacity of the reservoir. That's probably almost the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is really there, and luckily we didn't have it, but there was a situation in Oregon where where Detroit Dam and Big Cliff Dam, they're very close together, but on the order of a mile apart, and there's a canyon that comes in, and if that canyon burned during the fires about 6 years ago. And so if they had a flood event that came through that canyon, all that sediment would have dumped out into this very small reservoir. So there's a lot of potential. Luckily, unfortunately, there's no wood to knock on. The Corps has avoided most of the catastrophic consequences, but that's definitely a big concern, is because anytime you get a large volume of water moving, even if you don't have a debris flow, you're still going to move a lot of sediment. And so, yeah, that definitely has potential to impact reservoirs, and as the operator of those reservoirs, then we have to figure out how do we manage that sediment.
As an example of how significant it was, more sediment was deposited in the 7 or 8 years following the Los Conchas fire in Cochiti than the first 40 years of its existence. So we ended up doing a post-fire multiplier. So each year after the fire multiplied to about 8 years of sedimentation in the reservoir. And as you said, fortunately, it's a very big reservoir, but I don't want to just be lucky, right? So
Right.
I will point out that there are some complex physics involved as a debris flow hits a reservoir, and depending on the temperature of the reservoir, the depth, there are a lot of complex things that we can figure out, but we just, need the time and the funding to do that. But that is something that is a concern to Travis and I. We have been for a number of years. And as he mentioned, this was the synthesis for our work. Albuquerque reached out to us and said, hey, we don't really know what to do, right? And so our tools have made that a lot more, lot less reactive and proactive, but there is still work to do because of the complex fluid mechanics interactions of these flood events. And particularly of interest to some of these reservoirs is also, as Travis mentioned, Detroit, the water comes in warm because there's more sunlight hitting the trees. So, temperature variations can wreak havoc on how the system circulates, because in a lot of these reservoirs, there can be a natural circulation process throughout the seasons. And if those are altered, then you end up, altering the critters downstream.
Yeah, sure. Lastly, partners. I know you've talked about some of them throughout the broadcast, but kind of who are some of the partners that you work with in this effort?
So, yeah, we have both obviously our almost all of the ERDC labs, our districts are key partners. The Course Hydrologic Engineering Center as being the developer for some of the main software tools that are used by the Corps and by many people across the world. But we also we do interact quite a bit with people doing related work at the USGS. They do a lot of data collection, and the U.S. Forest Service does a lot of post-fire work. But we also have academic partners. So right now we have active post-fire collaborations with Portland State University, really focused on a small watershed, the Willamette, and kind of monitoring things there. We've got a partnership right now with Colorado State University where we're doing some work with them, and then we're also doing some work with the Desert Research Institute out of Nevada.
New Mexico Tech.
That's true. And I forgot about the work with New Mexico Tech.
It is a very wildfire centric problem, but it isn't focused on fires. It's ephemeral sediment processes. So ephemeral systems are ones that are dry most of the time. And so what we see is a lot of very complex responses to that. So we've been working with them formally for a few years, but leading up to that, they have a system, data collection system there that's world renowned. And so it's another. And then I'm trying to think. I feel like maybe we missed. But yeah, those are our major.
Sure. Those are the ones that we're actively working with at the moment, and there have been other ones
through the years.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I'll point out at the academic level that we're seeing, and this is something that I've identified years ago, is that we also have to worry about training a workforce that can address wildfires, suppression, recovery. And it's a bit of a challenge because you have to do ecology, you have to do, water resources, you have to know non-Newtonian fluid mechanics. And so one of the things that we're also working on is much like we have with Tulane and other institutions, to where we can actually have certificate or educational opportunities and develop curriculum specifically for this with our university partners, so that we can train the future generation of this multidiscipline challenge that we see. So I think for me, that's something very important, that, as we're funding this work, we're also producing the future workforce that are going to help us address this concern. So as a lot of times you say non-Newtonian fluid mechanics, people run, right? But, embracing some of that in a curriculum is going to be important.
The other academic partner we have right now is University of Nevada, Reno.
That's right.
We're doing some work with them as well.
Yeah, great. Well, great. Thank you all so much. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Pleasure.
Great.
Absolutely. An important issue. And again, thanks for all the work that you're doing to try to help mitigate against this threat that, as we said at the top, not a lot of people are fully aware of. So
a little disconnected here on the east, but
yeah.
Glad to be here. Thank y'all.
Great, thanks. And to our audience, I remind you again to go to our website, poweroferdcpodcast.org. There's a lot more resources there, as well as video of all the interviews, the audio version of all the interviews. And until next time, we'll see you then.